they're definitely more than proxies. They have a life of their own in their domestic scenery. Groups in Iraq, a particularly diverse context with groups that are supposedly Iran aligned, and in some way or another, and to varying degree they are, but they also have competition and rivalry between themselves.
Let me ask you, first of all, Sir Richard, what do you make of the way that the United States is talking very openly about its concerns that Iran may be about to launch some kind of retaliatory strike for the attack on its consulate in Syria?
Well, anybody who's followed the Middle East knows that Iran will attack. You should always take what the supreme leader of Iran says seriously. But the nature of the warnings from Washington suggests that they have intelligence. We can't assess that intelligence, but there are three ways of approaching it that I can see. One is that Iran is undertaking some sort of misdirection about the imminence of an attack on Israeli soil as part of the psychological and information war. The second option would be that it's part of the United States diplomatic and military campaign to ready themselves and Israel for the inevitable reaction by Iran. And thirdly, that it is indeed a genuine, well-sourced prediction that Iran will use its missiles or drones in an attempt to attack Israel.
Sanam, what do you make of this? I mean, Israel has not admitted that it was behind that strike on the Iranian consulate. What do you make of these warnings we're hearing, which seem to focus most likely on a direct attack on Israel?
First of all, Israel wouldn't and doesn't have a track record of admitting and taking responsibility for such strikes. So that is not surprising at all. But what we are hearing in the public domain, I sort of ascribe to a war of words taking place where red lines are being set down, and we are sort of testing out what could take place. I would be very surprised. I don't have access to intelligence either, but I would be very surprised if Iran would launch a direct strike itself on Israel. One has to, I mean, of course, these are unprecedented times, but one has to examine the behavior of the state. And it's not very often that Iran pushes itself forward militarily in such a brazen way. Since October 7th, Iran has been very consistent in its messaging that it doesn't seek a broader escalation or regional conflict. What I think Iran will try to do, and this is of course going to be extraordinarily difficult, is to try to signal strength, perhaps through a performative and well-coordinated attack by Iran's Axis of Resistance network to show strength, maybe not the strongest show of strength, but to show some degree of strength to its domestic audience and its regional partners, and of course to Israel itself, without at the same time provoking the counterattack.
Yeah, and we're going to talk in just a moment a bit more about the relationship between Iran and those groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, which are linked to it. But let me just ask you, Adnan Tabatabai, I mean, any nation, if there was a direct attack on its embassy, its consulate, would want to respond, wouldn't it? I mean, it's all very well people seeing the damage and the destabilizing effect that Iran has around the world. But Iran was, in this case, the subject of a direct attack on one of its embassies.
It was indeed. And I think we have to take into consideration that the level of humiliation of Iran through such operations is quite high, and that of course that sparks the need to respond in one way or another. You asked about other nations, what they would do, and I think what matters most is what options do nations have to respond in a way that really brings some sort of dividend to the strategic posture of the country, And here we will have to say that all the rapprochement that has happened in the past 1 or 2 years between Iran and its immediate neighboring countries, in particular in the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, this has effectively limited Iran's option to, for example, break out of its behavioral pattern that Sanam was referring to by, for example, attacking Israeli presence in the UAE or in Bahrain, UAE being the United Arab Emirates. And so Iran will now have to calculate how can Iran win the deterrence game vis-a-vis Israel or restore its lack of deterrence while at the same time not undermining other strategic goals such as regional rapprochement with Arab neighbors or regional integration more broadly. And that makes it very difficult for Iran currently to, in fact, find a meaningful way to respond.
Sir Richard Dalton, we hear endlessly about Iran's proxies and its backing for Hamas in Gaza, for Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and indeed for the Houthis in Yemen, who've been carrying out these attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. How should we see the relationship between Iran and these other groups? I mean, it doesn't have direct control over them, does it?
No, and the first thing to say is that Iran is not the only country which seeks to influence the outcome of conflicts by intervening militarily, politically, or with financial assistance beyond its borders. The United States, Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran are all up to it. And that's one of the reasons that the Middle East is in such a dreadful state. Iran perceives a military threat, quite rightly, from Israel and the United States, and it has sought a policy of forward defense in which not only is it seeking to support allies within countries that are in conflict, but it has positioned large quantities of weapons, particularly with Hezbollah, to act as a deterrent against a frontal attack on the Islamic regime or the territory of Iran. The Houthis took Sana'a against the advice of Iran. Hamas didn't get approval or require any such approval for its appalling attack on the 7th of October. So you need to look not just at the circumstances of the individual conflict in which Iran is engaged, also the ideological affinity between the groups concerned. So naturally, the Shia of Lebanon, in circumstances of civil war in Lebanon, have attracted this particular support from Iran, but also at the short-term interests of being in a position of power to influence the outcome of conflicts in countries like Iraq, which are neighboring to Iran.
Adnan, I mean, people listening here in the UK may listen to all this and just frankly find it all rather confusing to understand who's pulling the strings, or what the overall objective of these different groups are.
Yes, and I think this is why it's important to listen to what Sir Richard just outlined, because these groups, this network of the axis of resistance, and I referred to earlier, they're definitely more than proxies. They have a life of their own in their domestic scenery. Groups in Iraq, a particularly diverse context with groups that are supposedly Iran aligned, and in some way or another, and to varying degree they are, but they also have competition and rivalry between themselves. And they may, in fact, leave the alliance with Iran at a point where action of this particular or that particular group in Iraq could serve this group for its own domestic posturing. And in the same way, the Houthis in Yemen, or the Ansar Allah movement, is benefiting greatly currently from its posture in the Red Sea, also for its domestic posturing vis-a-vis other political factions and groups in Yemen for the discussion around the future of the country. And all of that, of course, means that Iran has created a network that is somewhat cultivated along its own political goals, but these groups can deviate when their national agendas have imperatives for them to act differently.
And Sanam Vakil, do you think that the war in Gaza, Israel vowing to try to eliminate Hamas entirely. I mean, how does that resonate through these different groups?
Well, Hamas is part of the axis of resistance, a partner of its own, and the relationship among the axis is also quite complicated. Iran and Hamas have not had the warmest relationships over the years, but this network comes together aligned in resistance to the United States and to Israel's role in the region, and they cooperate on this ideological basis. The axis is operating for the first time since October 7th in a coordinated and transnational way. So there's certainly an interest in all parts of the axis to keep Hamas operational and alive. And in fact, in the early days and months of this war that has dragged on far too long, the low-level escalation and pressure from the Lebanese border, attacks that came from Syria and Iraq, were also designed to distract and divert attention in order to help Hamas survive this war and remain intact in some capacity. However, what has also become clear since October 7th is that neither Iran nor Hezbollah are willing to sacrifice or degrade their own capabilities wholeheartedly for the benefit of Hamas. They see this conflict with Israel, this resistance-based conflict, as long-term and long-running. They want to survive this round of the conflict and perhaps prepare for what they anticipate will be a bigger and more direct engagement between Israel and Hezbollah, or Israel and Iran. So that's very much on the horizon and important to consider.